On September the 16th, 2022, 22-year-old Iranian woman Mahsa Amini died in hospital 3 days after being arrested by the morality police for not wearing a hijab. The Iranian police claims that she collapsed, but eyewitness accounts and bruises on her body suggest that she was beaten. Amini's death triggered some of the largest protests seen in Iran since its 1979 Islamic Revolution, with thousands of protesters rallying against the strict religious law implemented by the regime. The government cracked down hard on these protesters, with over 500 killed, thousands injured, and many more detained. Following these protests, things seemed to change in Iran, with more women walking in defiance of the hijab law in the streets of Tehran, and the morality police stepping back, with numerous protesters receiving pardons from Ayatollah Khamenei. However, as the protests have faded, the morality police have been redeployed, whilst the government has announced the use of facial recognition in CCTV cameras to further crack down on protesters. So, all in all, has anything changed in the 1 year since Mahsa Amini's death? Has the Islamic regime in Iran been weakened by the protests, or, with its harsh crackdowns, has its stronghold grown? Is there any hope for the future for the protesters? And, 1 year on, what is the legacy of the Mahsa Amini protests?
All right, so let's get to it, and excuse my long, perplexing introduction. Now let's cut to the chase. 1 year on, what is the legacy of the Mahsa Amini protest? As always, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each, to lay out your initial take on the matter, and we pick it up from there. So, Ms. Mortazavi, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
All right. Well, I think what we saw the last year bring was nothing short of a cultural revolution. I want to be careful in calling it a cultural revolution. Essentially, women pushing the state back, showing up for Mahsa Amini across the country and saying, enough is enough. You can't kill us for how we dress. This is a continuation of a 4-decade fight of women and girls against the mandatory hijab, against the state's one perspective reading of the religion and the religious satire. And I think they've pushed the state back to a place that can't be reversed. They can't go back to before September 2022.
Mr. Ben Taleblu, your thoughts?
Yes, indeed. I think 1 year on, the chasm or the divide between the street and the state, or the state and society, couldn't be wider. I personally frame or see these protests triggered in September of last year as really the continuation of the larger nationwide uprising we've seen in different boom and bust cycles since late 2017, early 2018, which has social, environmental, economic, and political components and triggers to it. And the message, when you connect the dots, is quite clear. The people of the Islamic Republic want a full change of regime away from the Islamic Republic and not reform of that.
Last but not least, Dr. Javendafar, your thoughts?
This was a political uprising. It started with the question of the hijab, but it soon turned into, from first the slogan of women, life and freedom, it very quickly turned into death to the current regime, death to Khamenei. I think this is a continuation of the search of the people of Iran for democracy, and they see the current regime as incompatible with freedom, incompatible with women's rights. This is just one demonstration, one series of demonstrations along many, which increasingly call for the downfall of the regime.
All right, ladies, gentlemen, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards, to engage in a conversation. And Ms. Mortazavi, I do want to begin with you, because if we're looking at this point in time, was there a boomerang effect, so to speak? Did protests ultimately undermine civil freedoms?
No, I don't think so. I agree with the other panelists that this was very much a mass protest of intersectional groups of the society who were demanding political, economic, cultural change, essentially an entirety of the regime. But what I meant by the Cultural Revolution is that regime change wasn't achieved over 1 year, but the Cultural Revolution did happen. The evidence of that being women and girls now showing up in Iranian public without the headscarf, without the mandatory hijab. Yes, they're risking their lives, they're risking their career, they're risking arrest, but nevertheless they're showing up, and so they have successfully pushed the state back one step when it comes to their bodily autonomy and what they want to dress. And I think it was a giant leap when we look at 4 decades of fight of women and girls. What we saw, the change in the past year, that's why I call it a cultural revolution. The Iranian public space looks very different than it did last year.
Dr. Javendafar, please chime in.
Well, I think the level of concern by the Islamic Republic regarding this uprising was shown not only during the uprising, but afterwards, when the regime went around poisoning schoolgirls. The regime is scared of Iranian women because it sees them as the future mothers of the next generation and possibly of the next revolution. Just as the mothers during the reign of Reza Shah, who forced women to take off their veil, gave birth to the next generation of revolutionaries in Iran who, based on what we know now, or false beliefs, believe that Ayatollah Khomeini will give them freedom. Today, the regime is very scared of Iranian women, especially we saw it in the last set of demonstrations. And this is why it's so adamant on the question of the hijab. This is why it's the Berlin Wall of the Islamic Republic, the question of hijab, because it views women as the issue of the women's rights as a watershed. For its legitimacy, for its rule over the public, and it's very scared from what it sees from Iranian women, which is why it went around poisoning young schoolgirls in order to create a deterrence against future such uprisings.
So, Mr. Ben Taleblu, is there an in-between? Can the Iranian regime make any concessions while keeping its character? Is there room for flexibility here at all, or is it either or?
I think you asked a great question, and really the caveats in the middle and end of it, are really the signposts of the trend lines for the future, because it is exactly the character of the regime that will prevent it from making the necessary concessions to meet the demands of Iranian protesters. But make no mistake, the demands of the Iranian protesters since at least 2009, but definitely since 2017, have been protests like death to the dictator, have been slogans like death to the dictator, have been slogans about the nationalism of Iran rather than the Islamism of the Islamic Republic. It is part and parcel of the larger century-wide struggle for representative government and democratic government, as Meir mentioned as well. And these are things, these slogans in particular, and these signposts for change are flashpoints at the West, and particularly those who claim to stand with the Iranian people, if not in principle, then at least, if not in practice, then at least in principle, need to be taking note of, because the fear, as Negar was mentioning, is indeed eroding. It is indeed gone. People know that they're risking life and limb. People know that they're actually going to be facing the injustice system of the Islamic Republic, the weaponization of cyberspace against protesters. All of these things are massive changes which have occurred over the past few years and have accelerated really since the killing of Mahsa and the nationwide protests since. The question is the world watching, and what lessons are they drawing? Many claim to stand with the people in practice, but what 1 year later does that mean in principle, when we know these protests are not going to be going anywhere and the regime is not going to make those necessary concessions to essentially write itself out of history and get out of the Iranian people's way?
But Dr. Javendafar, are Iranian rulers even interested in popular support, or they're still somewhat trapped perhaps in a conception that the wedge between Iranian people and the Iranian regime can be mended by force?
I think the Islamic Republic has always been interested in its legitimacy. This is why there have always been, it continues holding elections as limited as the choice that the people of Iran had. But I think we realize that the regime is realizing that it can no longer rely on the legitimacy of the people of Iran, and that it had lost it when it allowed Raisi to win these elections, to be the only real participant in that one-man race, really, which was the Iranian presidential elections of 2021. And the claim that that he got the majority of the vote, and even by the regime's own standards, the amount of people who turned up to vote was one of the lowest. The regime says, I think if I'm not mistaken, 46% turned up to vote. In the reality, that number could be half. The regime has realized that it has lost the legitimacy of the overwhelming part of the society. that it doesn't work anymore trying to run off two different candidates with different views in order to draw people to the ballot box. It's over. The regime knows this, but it's adamant to stay in power. Eli, this regime is not going anywhere. This is a regime that's friend of Bashar al-Assad. Unlike the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah, during the revolution, I think between 600 to 1,000 people were killed during the 1979 revolution, according to Dr. Erva and Ebrahimian. The regime is willing to kill 100 times more than that. I hope I'm wrong, but this is a regime that's willing to shed blood to stay. So as much as we are all proud of what the people of Iran did during the Mahsa uprising, those of us who want revolution and freedom for Iran realize that the cost will be very, very high.
So, Ms. Mortazavi, the regime is here to stay, Dr. Javendafar is saying. What about protesters? Protests, will they be renewed?
Well, I agree with Meir. I think what the protesters are posing to the Islamic Republic is a serious legitimacy crisis, and the regime understands that. That's why they resort to violence. That's why they resort to brutality, killing on the street, arresting thousands, putting them on execution, threatening families, even preventing funerals, because the legitimacy crisis shows that a big portion of the population doesn't want them. The youth doesn't like how things are done, and they want fundamental change. But the protesters haven't been able to pose an existential crisis. Again, I agree with Meir, and because the regime has a monopoly on power, on force, on violence, and they're willing to use the maximum violence, brutality, as you said, Eli, that bring down the iron fist, which they have done. I don't think the protests are going anywhere. We're going to see more and more mass protests, probably in shorter intervals, because the grievances are not answered, because the protesters are not seeing change. The youth don't have a prospect for their future. But at the same time, I still don't see that tipping point of this becoming an existential crisis and bringing an imminent end to the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, well, excessive use of force is rarely, if ever, a demonstration of strength, and yet, of course, with all the caveats. We are taking a very quick break now, but when we get back, we are talking about other sources of legitimacy to the Iranian regime, and that is the international community. Peculiar timing this week of this prisoner exchange between the U.S. and Iran. So, dear panelists, you're staying with us a few minutes, and we're back with the summit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Behnam Ben Taleblu, Dr. Meir Javendafar, and Negar Mortazavi. Thank you very much for staying with us, dear panelists. We're also staying on topic, but before we get back to our conversation, well, as mentioned before the break, it really doesn't get any timelier. A day after the one-year anniversary weekend, controversial U.S.-Iranian prisoner exchange deal is being executed. Has the West forgot about Mahsa Amini? Let's take a listen and pick it up from there.
We hope to see the complete repossession of assets by the Islamic Republic of Iran today, and that the frozen funds in South Korea will all be transferred to Iran's account in a friendly country in the region. The government of Iran should have complete access to it, to use according to its need. 5 Iranian prisoners will be released today, and in return, 5 citizens who were imprisoned in the Islamic Republic will be delivered to the American side as per their request. We expect that these 2 issues will be completed according to the agreement.
All right, let's get to it. Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each, and we take it from there. Was Iran able to normalize its global standing? Behnam Ben Taleblu, please take the lead.
It's clear this year, particularly in the past few months, the Islamic Republic has tried to be on something of a diplomatic charm offensive. You saw the restoration of ties with Saudi Arabia brokered by China. Iran is trying to show us breaking out of the diplomatic box, a diplomatic box very much earned and deserves to still be in, if you ask me. But there's local and regional reasons for those drivers as well. Iran trying to find its own pushback to the Abraham Accords, trying to say that Tehran bested Jerusalem to Riyadh, all of that. But in the aggregate, that plus the hostage deal, plus the $6 billion, which in my view is ransom, is in many ways why I draw the line between standing with the Iranian people in practice versus principle, because this, again, is an own goal, in my view, from Washington.
Dr. Javendafar, your thoughts?
Well, I unfortunately, despite some of the moves that you could be interpreted as stabilizing, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia reestablishing relations, I actually I've never seen Israel and Iran closer to war since I started doing what I'm doing in 2005. I think Iran is going down a very dangerous path in Lebanon, especially, and this whole situation could very easily deteriorate into war between Iran and Israel and Hezbollah, and then between Iran and Israel.
Last but not least, Negar Mortazavi, your thoughts?
I think at least the Biden administration has been attempting to de-escalate some of the tension, as I agree with the other panelists have been, especially Meir, have been increasing the shadow war, the proxy war, and the potential of sleepwalking into a full-on conflict that would drag in the entire region. I think this move, the prisoner swap, is one small gesture, is one goodwill gesture on the U.S. side, on both sides, to try to diffuse some of the heat and reduce some of the tension and prevent a bigger conflict that could be brewing for the entire region.
All right, let's please feel free to interact. But Ms. Mortazavi, we are talking about $6 billion in Iranian assets. It appears to be more than just an attempt to diffuse tensions. Mr. Ben Taleblu dubbing it as ransom.
Well, I think I would frame it a little bit differently. It's not coming out of the pocket of American taxpayers. Essentially, it's Iran's own funds that were frozen at the request of the U.S. In South Korea, in a third country. Now it's being transferred to another third country. And as U.S. officials are explaining with the Treasury Department and some White House officials today, it's being strictly permitted for humanitarian, essentially existing humanitarian exemptions. So transactions very limited that are already allowed under U.S. law. That includes food, medicine, certain medical supplies. Yeah. It's supposed to be with full oversight from the Qatari government, a trusted U.S. partner, and also with some oversight from the American side. Unfortunately, this is how things are done in the real world. There are no good deals, but it's been a year of on and off negotiations, very intense, very complicated, and this is how the administration was able to bring these 5 Americans home that we're now seeing on the screen. Actually, it's very emotional scenes.
Yeah, no doubt about that. But Mr. Ben Taleblu, on the same breath, please.
Pardon, yeah, a few important footnotes, I think, to that timeline, which I think would be crucial. Yeah. One is that many of these escrow accounts, these frozen oil funds, being talked about publicly as Iran's money, yes, they're Iranian revenues earned in countries that were permitted to continue to reduce but still buy Iranian oil. These were lockup accounts, provisions created through acts of Congress, activated and enforced by the Obama administration in the pre-JCPOA, the pre-2015 period, that were resurrected again, then enforced in the 2018 period. Now, why would two very different people with two very different congressional and political standings look to resurrect and create these lockup accounts? Because those two very different people from two very different parties with two very different Iran policies had one fundamental qualm, which is if Iran's major source of revenue is oil and crude oil and petroleum products, they have qualms with how that money is spent. This is why the money was locked up in the first place, and why the bulk of U.S. foreign policy towards Iran in the past 4 decades is largely some kind of economic political containment to try to restrict the flow of revenues to the most destabilizing things, which are missile, military, and nuclear. Ultimately, unrestricting funds, even if it's in the most perfectly tightly controlled humanitarian sanctions environment, which existed in South Korea, and Qatar is a more permissive terror financing jurisdiction than South Korea. All of that notwithstanding, would in effect make money more fungible for Tehran. So something that the regime would have wanted to allocate to humanitarian transactions before would then be opened up to allow them to fund those programs, which we believe help the regime engage in foreign aggression and domestic suppression. And then even in the best of scenarios where we do have significant humanitarian exemptions on previous Iran sanctions regimes in the past, there's the example of Iran using traditional illicit financial practices like over-invoicing, taking advantage of food and medicine exemptions as existed in 2012, that led to them making basically a loophole or busting existing sanctions on Iran. So there is a very problematic track record here, and that's why many people do have longstanding concerns that one type of sanctions busted, one kind of relief will ultimately beget another. And what you see from the Islamic Republic, 10 billion from Iraq, 6 billion from South Korea. Now the play is going to be for 3 billion from Japan. There's going to be a meeting between the Japanese and the Iranians of the sidelines of the UNGA in New York. The qualm here is going to be, this is death by 1,000 cuts to a sanctions regime that was bipartisan.
Simply put, Dr. Javendafar, is the U.S., is the Western Iran policy hypocritical? Sanctions on the one hand, unfreezing assets on the other, on the third hand, negotiating a nuclear deal?
Well, I think first of all, it's very confused and wrong for President Trump walking out of the nuclear deal. That was a big disaster. Basically, we knew what was happening with the Iranian nuclear program. Everything was within a time frame, and he walked out of it. And now Iran is enriching at 60%, which is very far closer to a bomb than ever before.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when it comes to Iran getting 6 billion, at least 6 billion is nothing. Iran's budget is between 180 billion to has been as high as 330 billion dollars. This is a miserable amount that the regime has managed to negotiate with the Americans. This actually shows how the regime has so little regard for the people of Iran, because if it really cared for the people of Iran, it would reach a deal with President Biden, who was willing to return to the nuclear deal on a step-by-step approach, but Khamenei refused it, and to make matters worse, he went and supported Putin in his war against Ukraine. It's, so the regime should be ashamed of itself. 6 billion is a drop in the ocean of what Iranian people and what the Iranian economy needs.
Negar Mortazavi, in the short time we have left, wrap it up for us.
I agree with Meir. I don't see any benefit in pulling out of the nuclear deal, cutting diplomatic ties, and essentially ramping up maximum pressure. It just added to the maximum pressure by the regime against its own people, against the rights movements inside the country, the repression, and just increase this level of regional tension that we're talking about. So I think it's good that the Biden administration taking steps toward de-escalation, and maybe this will be the opening to more.
Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.